What if a book was so dangerous or like so labyrinthine that it didn't just tell a story, but it actively swallowed its own author and its characters, and eventually you, the reader?
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stepping into a very specific kind of abyss. We're exploring Roberto Bolaño's monumental posthumous masterwork, 2666.
It really is an abyss, honestly. I mean, it's a text that defies almost every conventional literary category you try to apply to it, you know?
Totally.
It operates as a murder mystery where the detective is basically missing. Or like a philosophical treatise disguised as a fever dream.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And it's also a horrifyingly accurate mirror held up to the systemic violence of the real world. But more than that, I think, it's a book about the failure of our systems.
Like all of them.
Exactly. Our academic systems, our philosophical frameworks, journalism, the justice system, all failing to process true horror.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are going to navigate this terrifying, beautiful maze together today.
We have to.
And for those of you listening who are already familiar with the sprawling architecture of this novel, we aren't just going to retrace the plot here.
No, that would take days anyway.
Right. We are looking for the mechanisms underneath the floorboards. We want to understand how Bolaño constructs this trap.
The architecture of the trap. Yeah.
Exactly. Tracing the path from the insulated, polite halls of European academia straight into the dark, beating heart of the U.S.-Mexico border.
Which is a wild pivot.
It is. And to do that, we have to start with the real-world creation of the book. Because the physical object you hold in your hands when you buy this book, it's actually the result of a profound betrayal of the author's final wishes.
Yeah, it's a really controversial origin story. So we are in the early 2000s. Roberto Bolaño is suffering from a severe liver illness.
He knows he's dying.
He knows his time is running out. So he leaves these very specific, meticulous instructions for this massive manuscript he's been working on.
Right.
He dictates that 2666 must be published as 5 separate books.
Not 1. 5.
Exactly. Released sequentially, 1 per year. He even went so far as to specify the exact price to be negotiated with the publisher for each one.
Which is so specific for an artist to do.
Right, but the reasoning was entirely pragmatic. He was trying to secure the financial future of his children, Alexandra and Lautaro, after his death.
So he is looking at this colossal artistic achievement like a project he considered his highest peak, surpassing even the critical acclaim of The Savage Detectives.
Oh, absolutely. He knew it was his masterpiece.
And he is carving it up. He's treating it like an annuity, like a life insurance policy to ensure his family survives his absence.
Yeah.
But that is not how you or I read 2666 today.
No, it's not.
We experience it as a single 1,000-page monolith, because after his death, his literary executor, his friend Ignacio Echevarria, and his publisher Jorge Herralde, they convened, looked at the manuscript, and completely reversed his dying wish.
They did. They published it as one massive volume.
Citing their responsibility to its literary integrity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the executor's note at the beginning of the text explicitly states that once they studied the work, a consideration of a, quote, less practical nature arose.
Wow. Less practical.
Yeah. They argued that the structural integrity of the text, this subtle subterranean web of motifs connecting the 5 sections, it demanded it be consumed as a whole.
They thought they knew better.
Essentially, yes. They posited that if Bolaño had not been facing imminent death, he would have naturally released it as a single, totalizing work.
I really struggle with this justification. It feels incredibly presumptuous to me.
It's definitely debatable.
Right. I mean, we have a man dying of liver failure, desperately trying to provide for his kids, and the literary establishment steps in and says, actually, we know it's best for the art.
It's the classic art versus commerce debate, but with literal life and death stakes.
Exactly. Think of it like a master architect who spends his whole life designing a magnificent, sprawling, haunted mansion.
Okay, I like this.
But right before he dies, the city zoning board, or in this case, his terminal illness, forces him to draft blueprints to build it as 5 separate practical apartment buildings so his kids can collect the rent.
Right, so they have income.
Yeah. But then the executor comes along, ignores the final blueprints, and builds the terrifying mansion anyway.
Which is what we got.
Right, but did combining it restore the text to its true form? Or did it violate the architect's final desperate act of agency?
It's a fair challenge. It really is. But if we look at the mechanics of the text itself, The parts desperately need each other to generate the overwhelming, suffocating gravity that Bolaño intended.
You think so?
I do. Because if you read this as 5 separate books over 5 years, you have time to recover, you know?
Oh, I see what you mean.
You have time to compartmentalize the horror. By forcing it into one massive physical object, the executors force the reader to carry the cumulative weight of the narrative.
You literally can't put it down. Well, you can, but it's always looming there.
Exactly. The sheer physical exhaustion of reading 1,000 pages becomes a necessary part of the psychological experience. You cannot escape it. Which brings us to the most enigmatic part of that physical object, the title itself.
Yes. 2666.
Right.
It's a date, clearly. But, and this is wild for anyone who hasn't read it, if you read this entire massive book from cover to cover, you will never find a single explicit explanation of the year 2666 in the main text.
Not once.
It is the title that hangs over the narrative without ever intervening in it.
Yeah, it's brilliant. To find the mechanism behind the title, you actually have to look outside the novel entirely.
Where do we look?
Back to an earlier book Bolaño wrote called Amulet.
Oh, interesting.
Because in his private notes, Bolaño indicated that 2666 operates around a hidden center.
Okay.
The physical geographical center of the book is the fictional city of Santa Teresa on the U.S.-Mexico border. But the temporal philosophical center is that date. Right. In Amulet, there's a character walking down Avenida Guerrero in Mexico City at night. She looks at the avenue and describes it not as a cemetery in 1974, which is when it's happening, but as, quote, a cemetery in the year 2666, a forgotten cemetery under the eyelid of a corpse or an unborn child, bathed in the dispassionate fluids of an eye that tried so hard to forget one particular thing that it ended up forgetting everything else.
Oh, wow. Let's pause on that image for a second.
It's heavy.
An eye that tried so hard to forget one particular thing that it ended up forgetting everything else. That fundamentally changes how we interact with this book.
It recontextualizes the whole thing.
It means we aren't reading a contemporary novel about the 1990s border crisis. We're reading an artifact from a distant dystopian future.
Exactly. In literary theory, we talk about vanishing points, right? The point on the horizon where parallel lines seem to converge and disappear, which organizes the entire perspective of a painting.
Right, like in Renaissance art.
Exactly. The year 2666 functions as the temporal vanishing point for this novel. It represents a horizon entirely defined by forgotten, buried, systemic violence.
So humanity just kept looking away until it went blind.
Yes. The trauma of the 20th and 21st centuries has compounded so deeply that the collective human eye has gone blind trying to repress it. When you hold this book, you are holding a monument to a forgotten future.
That is so chilling. And to understand how humanity reaches that vanishing point, Bolaño starts us as far away from the violence as possible, right?
He really does. Total tonal whiplash.
He begins in the highly insulated, deeply rational world of European academia.
The ivory tower.
Exactly. We are introduced to 4 literary critics who have built their entire identities around translating and analyzing the work of an elusive, completely invisible German author named Benno von Archamboldi.
Yeah, we have Jean-Claude Pelletier, a Frenchman, Piero Marini, an Italian who is wheelchair-bound with multiple sclerosis, Manuel Espinosa, a Spaniard, and Liz Norton, an Englishwoman.
The core 4.
Right, and their obsession with Archamboldi is total. And when we say Archamboldi is elusive, we mean he is an absolute void.
Like Thomas Pynchon levels of elusive.
Even more so. There are no photographs, no public appearances. Even his publisher in Hamburg doesn't really know where he lives. He's simply a name that produces a steady stream of brilliant, increasingly bizarre literature.
What fascinates me is the psychology of their obsession. Why do they cling to this phantom, you know?
It's definitely a coping mechanism.
Let's look at Manuel Espinosa, for example. He desperately wanted to be a great Spanish fiction writer, but he realizes with brutal clarity that he simply lacks the talent.
Which is a tough pill to swallow.
Oh, for sure. He is rejected by the literary cliques in Madrid, specifically this group of writers who style themselves as Jungerians.
And that detail is crucial for understanding Espinosa's psychological armor.
Tell us about the Jungerians.
So the Jungerians are followers of the German writer Ernst Jünger, famous for works like Storm of Steel.
Right, World War I stuff.
Exactly. Jünger represents a very specific aesthetic of conservative, militaristic stoicism, the romanticization of violence and steel, and the hardened male psyche.
It's very macho.
Very. And Espinosa wants to belong to this hardened, elite artistic vanguard, but he is fundamentally just an insecure academic.
He's a soft guy, playing it being hard.
Yes. Rebuffed by the creators, he retreats into the safety of analysis. He pivots, gets a doctorate in German literature, and uses the obscure Archamboldi as a cudgel to dominate the academic conference circuit.
It's total defense mechanism. They all use Archamboldi to shield themselves from their own lives.
Every single one of them.
Pelletier discovers him in a squalid Paris garret living in miserable poverty and uses the text to completely overwrite his own past.
Right.
Marini champions the work in Italy despite zero sales, substituting academic devotion for physical mobility.
Because of his MS, yeah.
And Norton experiences Archamboldi's work almost like a somatic hallucination. She reads his novel, Bitzius, in the London rain, and suddenly the oblique drops of rain and the earth seem to be arguing, speaking incomprehensible words to her.
It's like the text becomes a contagion. It infects them.
It really does.
These four minds inevitably collide at academic conferences, and they form a fiercely loyal insular quadrangle. They patrol the borders of Archamboldi scholarship ruthlessly.
Oh, vicious.
They are, destroying the careers of rival academics who they feel don't understand the work with the proper reverence. And they inevitably fall into a complex, messy love triangle involving Pelletier, Espinosa, and Norton.
Which is so much drama for academic conferences.
It is. But the profound irony here is that they are applying the highest levels of European rationalism, structuralism, and literary theory to texts that are fundamentally about the irrational, chaotic violence of the 20th century.
It's like they are trying to understand the devastating elemental power of a hurricane by meticulously studying the condensation on a glass of water inside a locked room.
That is a perfect analogy.
They are completely detached from the reality of what they are studying.
Yep.
And Bolaño exposes this detachment beautifully during a scene at a conference in Amsterdam.
Oh, the Swabian.
Yes, where they meet an obscure Swabian cultural promoter.
The Swabian is such a fascinating injection into the narrative. Swabia is a cultural, historic region in Germany, and the Swabian represents a deep, almost mythic connection to the German soil that the cosmopolitan critics completely lack.
Right, it's like an earthier guy.
Exactly. He claims to be one of the only people alive who actually spent time with the young Benno von Archamboldi right after World War II. He tells the critics a story within a story, which is a classic Bolaño mechanism to disorient the reader.
I love when he does this. So the Swabian describes hosting the young Archamboldi in a freezing, miserable Frisian town. They are having dinner at a tavern with a wealthy, highly cultured German lady.
Right.
And she recounts a trip she took to Buenos Aires in the 1920s. She went to a wealthy ranch where her husband, a former cavalry captain, raced horses against the locals.
Setting the scene.
Her husband beats the rancher's son, and he beats this fierce, terrifying little 16-year-old gaucho.
Gaucho is the key.
Right. The lady thinks her husband is simply a superior rider, a triumph of European equestrian skill. But after the race, the little gaucho pulls her aside and reveals that the rancher actually rigged the race to let the German husband win.
And the German lady is just tormented by this. The logic completely evades her.
She can't compute it.
No.
No.
Why would a wealthy Argentine rancher deliberately humiliate himself and his son by rigging a race to lose to a foreign guest? It makes no economic or social sense.
None.
So in this freezing tavern, she asks the locals if anyone can solve the riddle. Archamboldi, who has been silently eating this whole time, immediately speaks up.
What does he say?
He explains that the rancher and his son rigged the race out of pure extravagance.
Extravagance.
Yeah.
Not hospitality, not strategy.
Right.
They were overcome by a sudden, irrational desire to squander their own victory, to subvert the established order just for the absurd theater of it.
But the truly terrifying insight comes when Archamboldi explains the role of the little gaucho.
Oh yeah, this part is wild.
He tells the German lady that the gaucho was not in on the joke. Archamboldi says, "If you'd spent any longer with him, I think he would have killed you," which would have been an extravagant gesture in its own right, though certainly not the kind the rancher and his son had in mind.
Wow. What Archamboldi is doing here is diagnosing the innate, senseless violence of the world.
Precisely.
He understands that underneath the polite rules of civilization, underneath the wealthy lady's understanding of sport and hospitality, there's a raw, murderous extravagance. A desire to destroy for absolutely no reason at all.
And this story completely sails over the heads of the European critics.
They miss the point entirely.
Totally. They analyze the Swabian's tale for its narrative structure, its pacing, its thematic echoes of Archamboldi's later work, but they entirely miss the core warning. The violence is real, and it is senseless. Their academic frameworks are useless against it.
They're just living in an echo chamber.
Yeah. And the realization that their methodology is failing them begins to dawn when Pelletier and Espinosa travel to Hamburg to meet Arcimboldi's publisher, Schnell, and Mrs. Bubis, the widow of his original backer.
Right, they go looking for clues.
And walking through the red light district of St. Pauli, surrounded by the commodification of human bodies, they realize their search for the author can never truly fill the void in their own lives.
The deeper they go into the work, the more the work devours the explorers.
Exactly.
Then the illusion of their academic control shatters completely. They hear a rumor that Arcimboldi, this invisible 80-year-old Prussian hermit, has been spotted.
And not in Europe.
Not in a library in Berlin, but in Mexico City.
Right.
He was seen by a Mexican intellectual who goes by the nickname El Cerdo, the pig.
Which is such a Bolaño detail. So El Cerdo recounts receiving a midnight phone call from the police. He goes to a hotel near the airport, and there is the elderly Arcimboldi sitting barefoot on a bed in a room the police have raided.
Just bizarre.
El Cerdo bails him out, and they wander the ancient Aztec ruins of the Zocalo at night. Arcimboldi reveals he is catching a flight the next morning to Santa Teresa.
Which is this dusty industrial city on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Right. And the critics are utterly baffled. Why would their literary god abandon Europe for a violent border town?
So naturally, Pelletier, Espinosa, and Norton pack their bags and follow the ghost of Arcimboldi across the Atlantic.
They have to.
But when they arrive in Santa Teresa, which serves as Bolaño's thinly veiled proxy for the real-world Ciudad Juárez, the narrative violently shifts gears.
It's a complete structural break.
Because Bolaño understands that European rationalism cannot explain this landscape. To see Santa Teresa clearly, we must abandon the critics and adopt the perspective of a local mind that is actively fracturing under the pressure of the environment.
Yeah, we shift our focus to Oscar Amalfitano.
Tell us about him.
He's a Chilean philosophy professor who is teaching at the university in Santa Teresa. He is a man profoundly isolated, living with his teenage daughter, Rosa. And Amalfitano's background as a Chilean exile is vital here.
Because of Pinochet.
Exactly. He is a man who has already survived the systemic state terror of the Pinochet regime. He understands the mechanics of political violence in Latin America in a way the European critics never could.
Right.
But the ambient, inescapable violence of Santa Teresa is something entirely different, and it is literally destroying his sanity.
Let's look at the mechanics of his introduction, because Bolaño gives us one of the most absurd, haunting images in the entire novel.
The clothesline.
Yes. Amalfitano takes a book, specifically a geometry book called Testamento Geometrico by the Spanish exile Rafael Dieste, and he hangs it on his backyard clothesline.
Just pins it up there.
He leaves it there, swinging in the harsh desert wind day after day to see how it weathers the elements.
Hanging the geometry book is a profound physical metaphor for the failure of European logic. Geometry is the ultimate expression of rational, orderly, spatial relationships.
It's pure order.
Right. By hanging it out in the Sonora desert, Amalfitano is essentially testing whether the structured, enlightened thought of the old world can withstand the raw, chaotic, elemental reality of the third world.
And spoiler alert, it can't.
No. The book flaps in the wind, its pages turning pointlessly, completely impotent against the environment. It is Amalfitano acknowledging the uselessness of his own philosophical training.
Is he actually going mad, or is he simply the only character whose mind is adapting to see the reality of the city clearly?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because he begins hearing a disembodied voice in the night. It isn't a grand, commanding hallucination. It's a cynical, mocking voice that taunts him with homophobic slurs and asks deeply destabilizing philosophical questions like, have you asked yourself whether your hand is a hand?
His mind is attacking its own foundational assumptions.
He's also haunted by the ghost of his past, right?
Yeah, his ex-wife Lola.
Years ago, in Spain, Lola descended into a severe psychosis. She became obsessed with an institutionalized poet in Mondragon.
She completely abandoned her family.
Right. She left Amalfitano and the infant Rosa to wander the perimeters of the asylum, sleeping in train stations, consumed by a delusion. Amalfitano watched the architecture of a human mind collapse from the outside.
And now, in the isolation of the desert, he feels the same contagion taking root within himself.
But his madness gives him a terrifying clarity about the political reality around him. When the European critics finally track him down in Santa Teresa to ask about Arcimboldi.
Which is almost comical at this point.
It is. Amalfitano dismisses their polite inquiries and delivers a devastating critique of how the state uses intellectuals. He uses what is arguably the most powerful metaphor in the entire book, the mineshaft.
The mineshaft metaphor is essential to understanding the complicity of the academic and artistic classes in systemic violence.
Explain the mineshaft, because it's so vivid.
So, Amalfitano explains to the Europeans that in their world, an intellectual might be supported by a wealthy patron or an independent publisher, but in Mexico, the intellectual is inevitably fed by the state.
Right.
And the state does not care whether the intellectual praises the government or fiercely criticizes it. The content of the critique is irrelevant.
Wait, really? Even if they're criticizing the state?
Yes, because what matters is that the intellectual performs a specific function for the national climate. Amalfitano describes it visually. He says, the shadowless intellectuals stand on a pretty, well-lit, civilized stage facing the audience.
Okay, picturing this.
But directly behind them, upstage, is an enormous pitch-black mineshaft. And from the depths of this cave come terrifying, unintelligible noises, guttural roars, syllables of pure rage, the moans of the tortured and the dying.
That is horrifying.
The intellectuals cannot see into the mine. They are too terrified to look back. They only hear the raw, acoustic horror of the state's violence.
And what is their function?
They are translators of the abyss. Amalfitano says they stand on the stage and say, cheep, cheep, bow, wow, meow, meow.
They make animal noises.
Well, they take the colossal, horrifying roar of the animal in the dark, and they translate it into polite, civilized discourse. They write elegant essays about structural inequality, they debate post-colonial theory, they organize poetry readings.
Oh, I see. They sanitize the terror.
Exactly. They make the violence of the landscape digestible for the audience. By merely existing on the stage, the intellectuals validate the state, proving that society is still civilized, even while the mineshaft devours its citizens just out of sight.
And the European critics just listen to this and are completely bewildered.
They have no framework for it.
They cannot comprehend a world where their own academic tools are just a defense mechanism for a murderous state. Amalfitano knows his philosophy is useless. He sits in his house drawing bizarre geometric diagrams in his notebooks, trying to link disparate thinkers.
Right. He draws lines between the Marxist philosopher Leszek Kosciuszko, the theorist of weak thought Johnny Vattimo, the Stalinist victim Vladimir Smirnov, and the Soviet ideologue Mikhail Suslov.
Notice the specific figures he chooses here.
Yeah, these are all men who attempted to impose massive structural narratives onto history, whether through Marxism, aesthetic theory, or totalitarian ideology.
Amalfitano is desperately trying to map a rational structure onto the history of the 20th century. But the diagrams are meaningless webs. They are the frantic scribbles of a mind realizing that history is not a geometric progression, but a chaotic slaughterhouse.
Yeah, he sits in the courtyard of the university drinking bottled water, and he clearly recognizes that he is losing his mind.
But Bolaño gives us this terrifying detail. The realization fills Amalfitano with a strange, dark happiness.
Just a sense of relief.
Yes, because he finally understands that in a place like Santa Teresa, madness is a much more logical, mathematically correct response to the environment than sanity. Trying to remain sane while hundreds of women are being slaughtered around you is the true delusion.
And Amalfitano's internal fragmentation perfectly mirrors the external collapse of the city. He is a man waiting for the sky to fall, and he knows exactly who it is going to fall on.
Rosa.
Yes. As his daughter Rosa grows older and more independent, she becomes a target. The ambient violence of the city begins to narrow its focus toward his own front door.
At this exact moment of unbearable tension, Bolaño does something brilliant. He abandons the perspective of the philosopher entirely. He introduces a completely unconnected outsider to serve as our new lens.
Right, Oscar Fate.
We meet Oscar Fate, an African-American journalist from Harlem. Fate provides a distinctly different mechanism for processing the city, the distracted American gaze.
So Oscar Fate is actually the pseudonym of Quincy Williams. He works for a Black American magazine, typically covering politics or cultural features, but his editor sends him to Santa Teresa on a trivial assignment.
A boxing match.
Right, to cover a boxing match, because their regular sportswriter is unavailable. Fate arrives in the city profoundly adrift. He is mourning the recent death of his mother, floating through his days detached and numbed by personal grief.
Fate is looking at structured, rule-bound violence in a boxing ring, completely oblivious to the ambient environmental violence of the border until it physically bumps into him.
He's the perfect stand-in for the American public.
We engage with the border through commerce, through NAFTA, through sports and tourism, while remaining willfully blind to the human cost of those systems.
And Fate's awakening happens when he meets a local reporter named Guadalupe Roncal. She is a woman operating in a state of sheer, unadulterated terror.
Because she's actually looking at the truth.
Yes, she is trying to cover the femicides, and she forces Fate to look away from the boxing ring and look at the desert. She tells him about the hundreds of murdered women, the bodies dumped in the brush, and the vacant lots.
Roncal gives Fate a metaphor that redefines the physical geography of the city. Fate asks her about the massive local prison, and she tells him the prison looks like something alive.
This quote is so haunting.
She says, it looks like a woman who's been hacked to pieces. Who's been hacked to pieces, but is still alive. And the prisoners are living inside this woman. The violence in Santa Teresa isn't just a series of events, it is the very architecture of the place. The city itself is built out of desecrated bodies.
So Fate is pulled into a nocturnal descent through the city's underbelly. He teams up with a shady local operative named Chucho Flores, and through total happenstance, they cross paths with Rosa Amalfitano.
Which is terrifying, knowing what we know about the dangers she's in.
Exactly. She's out with Chucho and another dangerous individual. They end up at a brightly lit, massive, nightmarish restaurant called El Rey del Taco.
Let's talk about the mechanics of this scene at El Rey del Taco, because it is a masterclass in the banality of evil.
It really is.
There is no overt violence happening in the restaurant. People are just eating tacos under fluorescent lights. But Fate looks at Rosa, who is young, beautiful, and completely naive to the absolute predator sitting next to her, and he experiences a profound existential crisis.
Fate is struck by a literal physical pang in his stomach. He looks around the garish restaurant and asks himself what is sacred in his life.
What does he realize?
He realizes he has just been going through the motions of existence, doing his job, watching videos, sleeping with women. But sitting in this taco joint, he is witnessing innocence about to be devoured by the machinery of the city. He recognizes the immense vibrating danger of the environment.
He crosses the event horizon. Fate, the detached American journalist, abandons his assignment, essentially kidnaps Rosa from the thugs to save her, and drives frantically across the border back into the United States.
He just runs.
As he drives through the blinding desert light, he reflects on a conversation with Chucho Flores. Chucho described the killings of the women not as isolated crimes, but as a brutal fucking strike. Not a labor strike, but a strike on reality itself.
Fate realizes that his journalistic framework seeking neat narratives, clear motives, heroes, and villains are completely useless here. As Guadalupe Roncal told him, the secret of the world is hidden in these crimes.
And by fleeing across the border, Fate survives, but he fails to confront that secret. He escapes the maze.
He gets out.
We, however, do not get to escape. We've skirted the edges of this horror. We've looked at it through the hyper-intellectual distance of the European critics, through the fracturing mind of Amalfitano, and through Fate's frantic journalistic flight. Now, Bolaño strips away all of our defense mechanisms.
This is where the book gets really, really hard.
He forces the listener, the reader, to look directly into the void. We enter the fourth and longest section of the novel, focusing exclusively on the crimes.
This section is arduous. It's unrelenting and deeply traumatizing to read. It is a forensic, clinical accounting of murdered women, page after page, year after year, body after body.
It just doesn't stop.
No. Bolaño lists their names if they are known, or Jane Doe if they are not. He lists the clothes they were wearing, the exact dimensions of their stab wounds, whether they were sexually assaulted, whether they were strangled, and exactly where they were dumped.
In ravines, in cheap motel rooms, and in an illegal, sprawling garbage dump known locally as El Chile.
Reading it feels like walking through an endless morgue where the overhead lights keep flickering. It is an anti-mystery.
Because just when you think your mind has grown numb to the repetition, a new, uniquely horrifying detail is eliminated, and you are forced to process the trauma all over again.
The literary mechanism Bolaño uses here is crucial. He refuses to use poetic or dramatic language.
Why does he do that?
Because poetry would romanticize the dead. A dramatic narrative would give their deaths a satisfying narrative arc. By writing it like an endless police blotter, he forces us to confront the sheer mechanical scale of the slaughter.
We must look at the historical and economic context Bolaño is drawing from. The text presents a reality where the victims are almost uniformly poor. They are young women who have migrated from the rural south of Mexico to work in the maquiladoras.
The factories?
The massive foreign-owned factories that sprung up along the border following the implementation of NAFTA. The border operates as a free trade zone designed to facilitate the frictionless movement of goods into the global north, utilizing a vast pool of cheap, disposable labor.
The economic system fundamentally devalues human life. The women work grueling shifts, traveling home in the middle of the night through unlit, unpaved slums.
The economic machinery of global capitalism creates the perfect hunting ground. The bodies of these women are treated with the same disposability as the industrial waste produced by the factories.
And alongside this litany of the dead, Bolaño provides a forensic breakdown of the police apparatus meant to protect them.
Which is just as horrifying.
It is, because the police response is not merely a failure of competence, it is an active, systemic defense mechanism of the state. The corruption is absolute.
We meet Pedro Negrete, right?
Yes, the powerful, untouchable police chief who drives out into the desert to shoot stray dogs for target practice. And we meet Epifanio, a deeply cynical cop who takes a young rookie out for pozole at 5 a.m. and casually jokes that the traditional Aztec stew they are eating is made of human flesh.
Ugh. That rookie is Lalo Cura. He is a kid descended from a wild lineage of orphans and rape victims from a mythical place called Villa Viciosa.
And Lalo is actually trying to study modern criminology texts. He wants to apply forensic science to the murders.
But what do the older cops do?
They physically beat him and laugh in his face, explaining that modern criminal investigation does not exist in Santa Teresa. The police do not exist to solve crimes. They exist to manage the optics of the violence for the politicians and the factory owners.
To cope with the overwhelming reality of the femicides, the police actively manufacture distractions. Bolaño introduces a bizarre, highly publicized subplot involving Inspector Juan de Dios Martinez.
This part is so strange.
He is assigned to investigate a serial killer known as the Penitent. This madman breaks into local churches, desecrates the altars, urinates on the floors, and eventually murders a priest.
And the psychiatric director of the local asylum, Elvira Campos, theorizes that the penitent suffers from sacrophobia, an intense hatred and fear of the sacred.
But if we look closely, the entire concept of sacrophobia is a psychological projection.
Explain that.
The police and the public become obsessed with the desecration of the church because it is easier to mourn a profaned altar than it is to process the desecration of hundreds of human bodies in the desert.
Exactly. They fear the sacred because recognizing the sacredness of human life would require them to acknowledge the absolute profanity of their society. Martinez uses the high-profile hunt for the penitent as an excuse to completely ignore the dead women. He distracts himself further by carrying on a secret, entirely sterile affair with Director Campos.
Right.
They meet every 2 weeks, have sex in absolute silence, look at the mountains, and leave. It is a dead, mechanical response to a living nightmare. They are mimicking human connection while surrounded by death.
The police eventually realize they need a scapegoat to quiet the press, and they find one in a man named Klaus Haas. Haas is a giant, blonde German-American living in the Santa Teresa prison.
The police arrest him, claiming he is the mastermind behind the femicides. But even behind bars, Haas manipulates the system.
He's like a circus ringleader.
He really is. He holds press conferences. He calls reporters. He claims he is entirely innocent and points the finger at a pair of rich, protected kids, Antonio and Daniel Uribe.
Haas claims the Uribe boys throw wild, drug-fueled parties at their luxury estates, drive expensive SUVs, and have deep, unbreakable ties to the local narco cartels and corrupt politicians. They are the untouchable elite.
So the reader is presented with a classic mystery setup. Is the foreign outsider, Haas, telling the truth? Is he the killer, orchestrating murders from his cell to prove his innocence? Or are the wealthy Uribe boys hunting women for sport with absolute impunity?
But the terrifying genius of 2666 is its absolute refusal to give the reader the satisfaction of a neat answer. You never get the scene where the detective puts the handcuffs on the true mastermind and explains the motive.
Never. And to try to bring order to this chaos, the Mexican authorities bring in Albert Kessler, an elite American detective and former FBI profiler.
Kessler represents the ultimate failure of American empirical methodology. He arrives in Santa Teresa, drinks local bacanora, and looks out over the sprawling apocalyptic geography of the slums, like Cerro Estrella.
He asks to meet with Police Chief Negrete to coordinate the investigation and realizes Negrete hasn't even bothered to show up.
Because Negrete doesn't care.
Right. Kessler recognizes instantly that his sophisticated FBI profiling techniques are entirely useless. You cannot profile a serial killer when the killer is the society itself. He is looking at a landscape of absolute, impenetrable, state-sponsored impunity.
As the body count continues to rise, unchecked by Kessler, Haas, or the police, Rumors begin to spread south to Mexico City. Rumors that the deaths aren't just random acts of violence or the work of a single cartel, but that there is an organized, highly lucrative sub-industry of snuff films being produced in Santa Teresa.
An Argentinian reporter travels to the border, pays a shady contact in American dollars, and is taken to a secure house to watch one of these films.
The description of this viewing is gut-wrenching, precisely because of its banality.
Yeah.
The Argentinian sits next to a local man on a cheap sofa. He watches the film, expecting his journalistic detachment to protect him.
But as he watches the reality of a human being extinguished for profit, he experiences a petrified, paralyzing nightmare. He realizes he has touched the absolute bedrock bottom of human depravity.
He loses his mind. He flees the house in terror, becomes convinced his beer has been poisoned at a random taco stand, and runs to the airport in a blind panic to escape the city.
He, like fate, realizes that you cannot simply observe this violence. If you get close enough to see it clearly, it will destroy you.
If we connect all of these mechanisms to the bigger picture, the text forces the reader to confront a terrifying reality. There is no singular Moriarty pulling the strings.
No mastermind.
If Kessler catches one killer, or if Haas is executed, or if the URSummary are indicted, it simply does not matter. The murders will not stop. The violence is a product of geography, of the ruthless economics of the maquiladoras, of deeply entrenched machismo, and of absolute impunity. The crimes are the landscape.
And for you listening, while this is a work of fiction, Bolaño is holding up a direct, unblinking mirror to the real-world tragedies of Ciudad Juárez and the hundreds of women who actually disappeared there.
He is asking you, how much horror can you bear to look at before you look away? Before you, like the European critics, retreat into the safety of abstraction. Before you, like Amalfitano, retreat into the logic of madness.
Let's bring all of these disparate threads together. We have the European academics safely oceans away, dissecting literature to find meaning in a senseless world. We have Amalfitano hanging a geometry book on a clothesline, recognizing the total failure of rational thought.
We have Oscar Fate, the journalist who pulls a single girl out of the gravity well and flees back to the comfort of America.
And at the center of it all, we have the endless clinical list of victims buried in the dirt of Santa Teresa.
They are all caught in the exact same web. They are all circling the year 2666. It is a temporal vanishing point where human empathy has completely evaporated, where the eye has tried so hard to forget the horror that it has forgotten everything else. It is a heavy, monumental piece of art.
But there is one final piece of context we must discuss. A detail hidden in Bolaño's private notebooks, discovered only after his death, that recontextualizes the entire thousands of pages we have just analyzed.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
Bolaño wrote a single line in his notes outlining the structure of the novel. He wrote, quote, "The narrator of 2666 is Arturo Bolaño."
Now, for readers of Bolaño's wider universe, Arturo Bolaño is a recurring character. He's the protagonist of The Savage Detectives. But more importantly, Bolaño is universally recognized as Roberto Bolaño's direct, undisguised literary alter ego.
And for the very end of the book, Bolaño left this fragment in his notes. And that's it, friends. I've done it all. I've lived it all. If I had the strength, I'd cry. I bid you all goodbye, Arturo Bolaño.
Which leaves us with a haunting, devastating realization. If Roberto Bolaño himself is the narrator of all this horror, of the murdered women, of the European academics, of the fracturing philosophers, and the fleeing journalists,
The 9666 is not just a novel attempting to document the systemic failures of the 20th century. It is a massive 1,000-page suicide note from a dying author, weeping for a violent, broken world he is about to leave behind.
a world where the systems we built to protect ourselves have completely failed. And the only response left to the abyss is to finally, simply, close your eyes. Think about that the next time you hold a book that claims to hold the secret of the world.